Yo! Welcome back to One More Mana. My name's Derek, and today's deck tech is actually going to be on a deck that was already featured on an episode of the Command Center, and that's for Nikya of the Old Ways. This is a really cool card, and we wanted to go more in-depth and give a full-on deck tech to kind of talk about, beyond just the cards in the deck, kind of the theory behind the deck and what can make a deck like this run. First, it says you cannot cast non-creature spells. Obviously not a great start, but the second line of text is kind of crazy, and it says every time you tap a land for mana, you get an additional mana. So it's essentially a mana doubler on a creature. Basically, what this makes you do is you need to make a super creature heavy deck. This deck, as a matter of fact, runs 43 creatures, and that's insane. That's almost half of your deck being creatures. And one of the first things I thought of when looking at this deck and looking at this commander is kind of the difficulties that can go into building a deck like this when the normal stats of a deck are so thrown off. I remember the first time I built a completely creature-focused deck was for Sidisi Brood Tyrant, and it took me so long to try to find some version of it that worked because I just felt like all the normal parts I wanted in a deck with the ramp and the card draw and the removal was so off because I had so many creatures and so few slots for instant sorceries, enchantments, and some effects that seemed to be more focused in those types of cards. So what we're going to do today is go through all these creatures and show how you can have a deck with almost half of it being creatures and still hit all of the categories you need to for the stats of your deck. Although it's tempting to just, with a card like this that ramps this hard, just put a bunch of beaters in, you need all the basics to get this deck to run consistently, and you can still have fun with the big beaters once the deck gets rolling. Again, looking at the creatures, there are 43 creatures in this deck. It's a ton. So what we're going to do, it's a little bit different from a normal deck tech. Usually I'll break it down by creature, enchantment, sorcery, and go through, and I'm still going to do that, but I'm actually going to look into subcategories within the creatures to show how I kind of looked at the creatures as their own pseudo instants and sorceries to get effects that normally we'll get from those in other decks. So what I'd really love to do is use the deck stat suggestions that the guys over at the Command Zone talk about. That you always have that kind of base level where you want 10 ramp spells, 10 card draw spells, 5 target removal, 5 board wipes, kind of on and on. This can be super varied from deck to deck, but it's kind of just a baseline number that you usually want to shoot for unless you have a reason not to. So the first category we're going to look at within the creatures is ramp. Looking at the ramp, there are 7 creatures that fill in this ramp category, which, considering your commander is already a huge source of ramp, it can be a lot. But again, we have a lot of big CMC spells, so this is a really good way to do it. This can be very common in green decks, that there's a lot of good green creatures that serve as sources of ramp. But in a deck like this, you're going to run a Sakura Tribe Elder over Cultivate, or you would love to have a Farhaven Elf instead of an Explosive Vegetation, just because once you get your commander out, you don't want to just be sitting there with ramp sorceries that aren't going to do anything in your hand. Next, we're going to look at card draw. Again, guys over at the Command Zone love to recommend 10 sources of card draw, and creatures alone in this deck account for 7 sources of card draw, which is amazing. Obviously, you're going to have some other sources of card draw when you get into the non-creature spells in the deck, you'll see. But to have 7 already just within creatures, and this is amazing. And this is one of the harder things when you're building such a creature-heavy deck. You don't want to run out of gas. If you just keep dropping threat after threat, you need to be able to refill your hand in case of board wipes, because most creature decks are very weak to board wipes. But if you have all these sources of card draw within the creatures, refilling your hand, then refilling your board isn't such a daunting task after a board wipe. Speaking of protection from board wipes, this is one of my favorite categories within the creatures in this deck, because especially in a Gruul deck, when you're not running blue, you're not running white, you don't really get as many sources of protection for your creatures. I mean, if someone tries to cast a board wipe, you can't do fairies, you can't counter it. But not only in this Gruul deck did we find ways to protect our board, but we got creatures to do that, which is just so perfect. It works not so. Basically, it means once we get this huge board state with stuff on it and our commanders out, we don't have to rely on these non-creature spells. Our creatures can protect the board or protect themselves, which is awesome. So we do have 4 sources of this protection, and they all kind of serve slightly different roles. My favorite one by far, and it's card I love to run in a number of creature decks is Soul of New Phyrexia. This card is insane. If it's on the board, it is repeatable to make things indestructible. And even if it goes to your graveyard, you can still activate its ability to make your board indestructible. These sources of protection are so crucial in a deck like this because it can be scary to overextend and not want to overextend into a board wipe. But when you have all these creatures and all these ways to basically just beat face, you want to be able to go out and extend without fear of losing all of it. And these really help to prevent that. Now, before I mention removal, usually you want in that range of, for targeted removal, at least, 5 sources. A lot of decks would probably want even more. Board wipes, it completely varies. Especially in Gruul, there's not a ton of board wipes, so you might only be running a couple of board wipes. But this deck, looking at the sources of removal from creatures, we have 9 sources of removal just from the creatures. And this is so important. This is so important because you don't want to get to the point where if you get Nikya out, all of a sudden you just can't answer anything. You don't want to be stuck there and all of a sudden your commander is a hindrance to what you're trying to do. If you play it in the next turn, all of a sudden someone drops the Consecrated Sphinx and no one can deal with it, you're going to get buried in card advantage so fast. And being able to have these creatures be able to remove things for you is amazing because not only are they going to remove things, but again, you have another body on the board in a creature-based deck. It's phenomenal. This is exactly what we need. Now, these 2 cards, speaking of removal, are not a surprise to anyone, but if anyone is building a heavily creature-based deck that involves green, and most heavily creature-based decks will, you have to have these 2 cards in there. That first one is the Acidic Slime. This card is amazing. To be able to deal with artifacts, enchantments, and lands is so cool, especially lands. You don't want to be stuck in a situation where someone is able to just get out of Cabal coffers and abuse it without any answer for it. There's so many powerful lands in the format, and this is a great answer to have, especially in a creature-based deck. Terastodon's going to serve the same purpose. When it comes in, you get to destroy 3 non-creature permanents, and the vast majority of the time in EDH, really the non-creatures can be the scariest things. So to be able to drop this and destroy 3 of them on top of having this huge beater of a creature is amazing. It's a great way to have answers in addition to feeding your strategy of having big creatures. So this is kind of surprising, but when looking at all these creatures, there's really only 2 dedicated beaters in the entire deck, and that's Ghalta and Hungering Hydra. Every other creature in all these 43, in addition to being a beater, also works to serve some type of purpose that's going to help you in any number of ways. And that really just speaks to how much variation and how much kind of diversity you can put into your creature base outside of just big creatures, even in a deck that wants that. So, I mean, it shows you how much room you have, even in what seems like a very linear deck. Another kind of category that you can have in big mana decks is you usually want mana sinks. You usually want things to dump your mana into if you just have way too much mana on board. So really, especially in a creature-heavy deck, sometimes you're going to run into gas, sometimes you're going to have all this mana and just not know what to do with it. So there's some mana sinks we use that are creatures that essentially allow us to always have something to do with our mana. And the last category is a very vague category, but it just speaks to how much you can do with a creature deck, and that is the utility category. There's 17 creatures in this deck that fulfill some type of utility, and the coolest thing about it is a lot of these creatures are essentially just enchantments or sorceries or something else literally just thrown onto a creature, which means you're able to get those effects that you'd want in other decks on a creature, and it is amazing. Some of these even kind of cheat around that and allow you to cast spells that are essentially an enchantment. The best examples of that are 1, Xenagos. This card is amazing. Half the time you don't even want it to be a creature because it's easy to remove when it's a creature. But it does say the word creature on it, so when it's being cast, it is still considered a creature regardless of your devotion. So even if Nikya is out, you can still play Xenagos. And especially in a deck with beaters, you give them double the power, haste. You want this in any type of creature-based deck that the colors match for. And it does kind of cheat the system, and you're able to play it even though you can't play non-creatures. Another one I love in this category is Homura, Human Ascendant. This card is just so cool to me. I love the flip cards like that, but the best part about it is when you cast it, it's a creature, but it can transform into an enchantment. So similar to Xenagos, it's going to allow you to get enchantment-like effects and get an enchantment on the board essentially without having to worry about if Nikya is out or not. This is a great effect, and really you are getting an enchantment into play and kind of sneaking around the restrictions of Nikya. Cards like Ancestral Statue and Temur Sabertooth fit into the category of wanting to bounce Nikya back to your hand if you really do need to cast a non-creature spell, and all that was kind of talked about more in depth on the Command Center episode. Alright, so that's actually going to wrap it up on the creature portion, which is obviously the main focus of the deck, but real quick, I do want to talk about the non-creature spells in the deck. Then looking at the artifacts, we only need 7. Obviously, if we have 43 creatures, we don't have a room for a ton else. So really, the 2 most important ones seem to be Cloudstone Curio and Voyager Staff. Again, it's just ways to, if you have these out, you can balance your commander, so that way you can play a non-creature spell in a pinch if you really need to. And then we only have 4 enchantments. Again, we're going to have very low non-creature spells. My two favorite ones in there are going to be Greater Good and Lurking Predators. Greater Good just serves so many purposes in this deck. For one, it's a great source of card draw. You always want a sack outlet. At its very worst, you can stop something from being stolen. At the very best, if you have a huge creature and there's about to be a board wipe, at least you can draw a whole bunch of cards off of it. And even worst case, you can use this to get rid of Nikya in a real situation. If you need a Blasphemous Act and that's your only way to save yourself, you can sack Nikya, draw some cards off of it, and be able to get yourself out of that situation. Stolen Strategy is also a super exciting card. It's essentially like a weird version of Atali, except you don't get to cast them for free, but in this deck we can end up with so much mana. Sometimes you might run out of things to do in your own hand, so being able to exile the top card of everyone else's library and cast a whole bunch of stuff can be pretty fun. Looking at the sorceries, something I kind of wanted to point out is we do have some forms of sorcery ramp, and I know before I mentioned that we prefer the creatures, but the thing is, Nikya does cost 5 to get out, so sorcery ramp isn't completely useless. You do need to ramp to the commander, and this isn't necessarily a deck where you're going to play out Nikya as soon as you can. You kind of want a little bit of setup first, so we actually do have use for sorcery ramp in this deck. It's just much more limited than other green decks would be. In instance, there's only 3 of them. Rapid Vigor is just a super amazing card. Further Protection, which in a creature strategy, you need as much protection as you can get. And obviously Crossing Grip. If you're running green, you should probably be running Crossing Grip. Just that split-second ability so many times can come up huge in games. And it's just one of those things that you really don't realize how much you need it until you're in that situation. Lastly, we're running 38 lands. It's only a 2-color deck, so it's not too bad to just run a lot of basics. In all honesty, most of our ramp and the creature ramp that's searching for land is looking for basics. Obviously, if you want to get fancier with the mana base, you're more than welcome, but a 2-color deck, it's not always necessary. The 2 lands I really do want to highlight are High Market and Kessig Wolfrun. Now, these are the 2 non-basics that I feel like have the biggest impact. High Market, again, if you're in a real pinch and you need to sacrifice Nikya because you just need that non-creature spell, it's great to just have that land there as a worst-case scenario situation. Most of the time, we'll just be tapping it for regular mana, but that sack outlet on a land, again, lands tend to stick around, is just great to have. And Kessig Wolfrun, this card should be in every Gruul deck. This card is insane. With the amount of mana we're going to produce in this deck, you could literally have a Sakura Tribe Elder out and pump it with Kessig Wolfrun and all of a sudden be dealing 20 damage to somebody. It's insane the amount of damage potential in a card like this. And it's on a land. This card is just, I put it in any deck that has red and green. Even if it doesn't even focus around creatures, I want it in there. Just in case I have too much mana, I can just swing with anything and it's a big threat. This card is just so awesome. And that's going to do it for this week's deck. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed breaking this deck down. To me, creature-based decks can be a lot of fun when you have kind of the deck proportions thrown off that much. So please don't forget, for every deck tech, the Tapped Out deck list will be posted in the description below. Please subscribe on Tapped Out on YouTube, and I will see you guys next time.